Okay, so let's get started. Thank you, folks, for coming along tonight. I'm really happy that Allan has found time in his busy lockdown schedule to come and speak to BCS. As Mike said at the beginning, there are some limitations to this GoToWebinar platform that we're using. One of them is that you as attendees are not able to speak until we manually unmute each of you. So the way it works is we're going to get Allan to do his presentation, and at the end there will be time for questions. And if you would like to ask questions simply by typing it in, please type it in using the Q&A panel that you have as part of the GoToWebinar. If, on the other hand, you would prefer to interact verbally with Allan, and I'll remind you at the end, you raise your hand and I can unmute you. So we can work both of those ways. Now, a brief introduction to Allan. So Allan and I met as part of the ACCU, which is an organization that was originally founded in Oxford many years ago, and we attended the same conferences and essentially honed our skills in this among the same groups. However, Allan has gone on to write literally dozens of books. He seems to churn them out at a spectacular rate, and every single one of them is not just interesting but useful. The one that came out most recently is his book on OKRs, and you see a picture of it here on his slide. And I've been using that in the organization that I work in at the moment, and I have had no qualms whatsoever about recommending it to people who are struggling to apply OKRs in the typical agile spaces that we often work in the software industry today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Allan and say, tell us how to reawaken Agile with OKRs.
Thank you, Seb. You're too kind there. I think the secret of any book is the person who learns the most from the book is the author. And in some ways, this book, yes, it was a product of lockdown. Most of it got written last year while we were, confined to our homes. To a large degree, it was me trying to make sense of OKRs because I started as an OKR cynic. And I could give you 101 reasons why OKRs were not a good idea. But the organization that I was working with and coaching agile teams just decided, handed down the mandate from on high, thou shalt use OKRs. So as cynical as I was, I had to bite my lip, and I thought, okay, let's treat this as an experiment. Let's run with them and let's see what happens and what can I learn. And you know what? To my surprise, I found them useful. To my surprise, I found they kind of worked. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying they're not without flaws. I'm not saying they're easy. But you know what? They were very useful at focusing the team and allowing us to determine what we're going to do and getting away from the tyranny of the backlog. So partly writing this book was an attempt to record the lessons I'd learned about working with OKRs, and partly it was an attempt by myself to reconcile my preconceived views of what I found using OKRs. And hopefully you're all going to rush out and buy the book. You'll find the last part of the book, the last section of the book, that is where my OKR cynicism is there. And I've parked, by way of warning, a number of things that can go wrong with OKRs. But we're not going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk about one of the potentials I see of OKRs, and that's to reawaken Agile. Because those of us who were there when Agile came out, not I'm claiming Seb and myself were there at Snowbird, but we were there when Agile was a new thing and we were all getting excited about it. And somehow Agile maybe has lost its way. And I think maybe OKRs can help with this. So for those who may not come across OKRs before, they're quite simply objectives and key results, OKR. I actually would prefer to think about them as outcomes and key results. Slightly less grand perhaps, but it puts the emphasis on we are trying to achieve some outcome. I think that makes a lot more sense to me. So OKRs, officially objectives and key results, unofficially outcomes and key results. Let me carry on. Hopefully you're going to rush out and buy the book, but I'm going to give 2 copies away tonight. We've already posted this URL in the chat, but if you go to my website, allankelly.net/book-draw, you can stick your name and email address in there. And at the end of the day, I will draw out 2 people, and the first person out will get a physical book and the second person gets an ebook. If we remember and if we have time, we'll do it on screen and you'll see the random picker automatically. If for some reason it gets shunted out, I'll follow up with you one-on-one tomorrow. But please rush over and put your name in the draw. So what are objectives and key results? First of all, step back and say they originated at Intel, and I thought my camera was on, sorry. They originated at Intel, but they perhaps made most famous by Google. Now, other people cite other companies, and I'm not going to try and claim that other companies haven't had great success with them. It's just, in my experience, Google and Intel are the usual case studies. And the objective, pretty much like the name says, it's something you really, really want. It's a goal, it's an outcome. It delivers some benefit to someone somewhere. So it's something beneficial, it adds value. It is not a milestone. It is not a progress marker. It is not a tick in the box. This is not taking your 6-month Gantt chart and dividing it up into milestones. The outcomes are tangible things that you can at the very least use them to prove or disprove hypothesis. Hopefully they deliver benefit to your customers immediately, but maybe the benefit they deliver is that they are a hypothesis and you've tested the market, you've tested some technology, you've worked through something. So objective, fairly straightforward. Key results, a little bit more difficult. So these are important contributors to the objectives. I sometimes think of them as bounding criteria you have to work within. And I'm increasingly seeing them really as the acceptance criteria that you apply to the objective. Yes, everyone looks at them, and in the first instance, everybody says these are the key results, are the smaller goals that build towards the objective. And I'm prepared to concede that sometimes that is the case. Sometimes there's 10 small goals you need to score to win the trophy, but I'd rather we didn't do that too often. I think acceptance criteria is nearer the mark. Importantly, and one of the things that made me really nervous about OKRs in the beginning is they should be quantified. You should be putting numbers against these things. So yes, you should be setting targets. Yes, you should be measuring where you're at. Yes, you should be progressing towards them. And this is a bit of a double-edged sword because targets can be problematic, but at the same time, targets can be a good way of focusing your thoughts. Targets can be a good thing to race towards. Targets can be very motivating. Targets make it clear what success is. So we quantify OKRs, that's important. So that is your 2-minute introduction to OKRs. We now will move on to the guts of the presentation. But first, I want to talk about the virus, because after recent months and years, we can't really avoid talking about the virus, can we? It's everywhere. And that's the Agile virus. The Agile virus was first identified in 2001. We have every reason to believe the virus was circulating before 2001, but it was only in 2001 that it was named and defined. What has become clear is that it's not a virus that affects software developers. It's a virus that spreads through digital technology use. Software developers were the first people to contract the Agile virus because software developers have early access to digital technology. You know, instant messenger, websites, wikis, voice over IP, all that kind of stuff, which 20, 25 years ago was still new, and the only people who really had it were those who worked directly with technology, coders, testers, and similar people. Now that digital technology has escaped the programmers, we find the Agile virus elsewhere because other fields, marketing, even lawyers, are using digital technology, and the Agile virus spreads through digital technology use. And like all good viruses, it mutates over time, and it mutates for the better, and it mutates for the worse. So one obvious mutation is OKRs. A recent mutation of OKR, particularly where consultants are involved, is the addition of OKRs to the virus, which I think on the whole is probably going to be one of the good mutations. We see some negative mutations, and the fact that you are allowed to mutate Agile means that you're able to mutate your version of the Agile virus so that all you do is stand up at 9:30 every morning, bore each other silly for 30 minutes, and go back to what you were doing before. And you can call it Agile. So unfortunately, the ability to change Agile means we sometimes devalue it. And that, as a result, there are clearly two strains of the Agile virus. The first strain I'm going to talk about is corporate Agile, or as I sometimes call it, mild Agile. This is a kind of corporation you find in kind of Agile virus you find inside large corporations, as the name implies. There's another variation of the virus. I'm not really sure what the right name for this is. I'm calling it radical, but I'm open to suggestions. This version of Agile, you find more at startup environments, more at companies that have been born digital, that have grown up with Agile. It's the way they've always been. You go to and talk to any of the fintech challenger banks, and they wouldn't dream of working any other way. And you look at some of the fintech challenges, they've built entire banking platforms in 18 months. Most of our legacy banks, although they're infected with corporate Agile, yes, but it still takes them several years to make one change to their system. There's clearly two different types of Agile out there. Radical Agile is kind of perhaps the dream we all want, but what we see more often is corporate Agile. And the symptoms you see of corporate Agile, well, it's a weakened form of the virus. So it's not going to kill you, which is perhaps why it's more acceptable to large corporations, because they're not in danger of being killed by it. And it has a very high R value. It reproduces very quickly, but there's something else. I mean, I'll call the E value, E for effectiveness, and this is a much lower value. Radical Agile, R is lower, but E is higher. What we find is in a corporate environment, there's a cookie-cutter approach to Agile. There is a defined Agile, and it is rolled out to people, and they're on the receiving end of it. As a result, you can convert a lot of teams from what they were doing to this thing you call Agile quite quickly. You get very high reproduction. But what you find is the teams aren't as effective as maybe you hoped they were. The effectiveness is lagging. I think there's several reasons for this, the symptoms, if you like. For starters, the administrative processes remain intact. We may still be running a project model. We might still be running governance and portfolio management on the basis we've had for the last 20 years without any acknowledgement that when you work Agile, things are different. You find there's still a high faith in planning. There's still a desire to plan everything up front. Nobody ever gets fired for writing another plan. And one of the problems is when you have a lot of planning, it becomes difficult to deviate from the plans, and you're also disempowering the people who do the work. And this adds up to a lack of motivation with staff. There's a lack of fun generally. I remember when I first started encountering Agile, I was a programmer, and all those programmers wanted to do it. And in the first few years when I was an Agile consultant, I'd go out and people would be so keen to do it. Now, so in those days, you walk into a place and all the programs will tell you they want to do Agile, but their managers won't let them. These days, you walk into an organization and all the managers are really keen on Agile, but the programmers and the testers are all grumbling and they don't want to do it. They just see it as another change initiative being inflicted on them by people. So we've lost the motivation, we've lost the fun. And going hand in hand with it, we've lost experimentation. In the early days, a lot of the fun came because we were just trying stuff. We didn't really know if it was going to work. It was some wacky ideas. Somebody said, write all your requirements as a I can so that, and we tried it. Now that's kind of baked into a corporate handbook, and there's a lack of experimentation in all sorts of ways. And as a result, there's a lack of learning. People aren't learning stuff. We're not moving forward, and that feeds into the lack of motivation and lack of fun. We've moved over to this belief that somebody knows the right way of doing Agile, and we may even be able to write it down. When we've got teams who are experimenting and learning and almost making it up as they go along, you get a lot more fun and a lot more motivation. And the other side of that is that there's a lack of unlearning. This ties in with leaving the administrative processes and the faith in planning behind, in that when we move to a digital world, an Agile style of working, some of those things that brought us success in the past aren't so useful. Some of those things that brought us success in the past, like detailed plans, aren't necessary, but we still carry the cost of them. I remember once spending 2 hours in a meeting at a client bank with 12 senior people as they debated what user stories they were going to ask the outsourcer to quote for, so they could then tell the outsourcer to build them. And I remember halfway through the meeting realizing that you could build these things in a couple of days. But so you didn't need to do all that you need to do all that hard detail on what we're going to ask for and getting a quote. You could just try it in less time than it took to decide the stories. So if we're going to add new things, we need to take some others away, and that's often lacking. Ultimately, what this means is that by commoditizing Agile, we increase the R value, but we undermine the effectiveness. And when we undermine the effectiveness, we reduce the competitive advantage. The net effect is that when we introduce our cookie-cutter Agile, things are better than they were before. And I'm not one of these people who's going to talk about false Agile and fake Agile and all of that, because even bringing this kind of corporate Agile in, the organization is better than what went before. But at the same time, we're left with a longing. Some of us think we could do better. So that's the problem we face. We're doing this type of Agile, but it's a weakened form of the virus. So now to describe the problem, let me suggest that OKRs can help. And this might seem counterintuitive, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But OKRs, I think, are a good fit, partly because they are an alternative to the project model. Those of you who heard me speak before, you've probably heard me go on about problems with projects. The problem that we're left with if we don't have projects is, how do we know whether teams are succeeding or failing? How do we fill in the middle planning gap? We need something between the sprint plans, every 2 weeks, and the strategic plans lasting 5 years. We need some middle planning. And I think OKRs can actually enhance autonomy on teams. Now, this means that actually OKRs fit pretty well if you're in what I would call a no projects or continuous digital model. That's the same thinking behind value streams, or people who say product over projects, or teams over projects, or even the Spotify model. What these all have in common is they are models of continual working. They are not the stop-go approaches of projects where you assemble a team, you do something, you do it, you finish it, you disassemble a team, you start another project, you assemble another team. All these models are continuous. I think OKRs fit very well with that type of model. As I mentioned before, Intel and Google and even Bono like OKRs, and as a result, they're like my consultants, so that they're low risk. And they fit well with Agile. They're iterative, they're test-driven, they support independent units, they allow you to devolve authority, enhance autonomy, and as I mentioned right at the start, they are outcome-orientated. These are all traits they share with OKRs, so they are, if you like, they're culturally compatible. And importantly, in OKRs, failure is an option. In fact, you'll hear people say you should only plan to achieve 70% of your OKRs. 30% of them should fail. You should be trying to do more than you can do. The model is that if you aim high, you may miss the target, but you will achieve more than if you aim safely low. So with OKRs, failure is an option. Something's been implied by what I've said so far, but I really want to ram home. Objectives are not epics. There's a tendency to see objectives as epics and key results as stories, and that's not so, or at least not so most of the time. Objectives are not epics. Objectives are a hypothesis about the outcome you desire, that you need. And key results are not stories, they are acceptance criteria. Key results are what allows you to make your objectives testable. So hopefully, when you put this together, you realize OKRs are test-first management. So the ideas behind test-driven development, test-first development, behavior-driven development, all those kind of ideas that say, set your tests up front and then you build something to pass the tests. And OKRs are a similar type of idea. You're saying every 3 months, let's sit down, let's decide what we're trying to achieve. Let's think about how we're going to measure that. Let's think about how we're going to test it. Let's think about how we're going to decide whether we've achieved it or not. So I sometimes talk about OKRs as test first management. And surprisingly, OKRs can be team enhancing. Now, I pause here because there's a bad way of doing it, which perhaps we'll touch on in a moment. And I've been surprised since I launched the book how many people who are attempting to follow SAFe have been interested in OKRs. And one of the criticisms made about SAFe is that it devolves authorities from teams. And I don't see OKRs in that role. Someone pointed out to me the other day that SAFe is actually wonderful. SAFe's a great idea. It's just like communism. The problem with both is nobody's really tried them yet. So anyway, OKRs are team enhancing, autonomy enhancing, because they make space for autonomy. We have our team, and OKRs for the quarter, for the test period, allow us to put a box around that team. And the team say, during this period, during the quarter, these are the things we are going to do. The OKRs define their space. They define the outcomes the team is reaching for. They define the key results. They allow space for the team to be autonomous. Within that box, it's like it's a black box. Nobody needs to understand how the team are doing it. It's up to the team to deliver their OKRs. So you can think of it as having an API on the team. The team are saying, in the next quarter, this is what you can expect from us. So it's just an API on the team. Pause for a moment, take a drink. So again, I mentioned before that OKRs are derived from an older technique called management by objective. And this is where things start to go wrong with OKRs and autonomy. I think part of the problem is that very few people don't actually bother learning about OKRs. People say, oh, OKRs, they're a bit like management by objective. And the person who hears that immediately maps OKRs into the space in their brain that tells them about management by objective. If you've not come across it before, management by objective starts off as a good idea. The people at the top of the organization should set objectives, and those objectives should be passed down to the next layer in the organization. And the next layer in the organization should pass down their objectives to the layer below that. So you get this cascading effect as the management by objectives are rolled out throughout the organization. And unfortunately, this is how some organizations will implement their OKRs. In fact, I've started calling them COKRs or cascading OKRs. There's this idea that one or more people who are senior in the organization can issue mandates, and the mandates are picked up by the next layer down, and they issue their mandates, and it all cascades down. This is how management by objective used to work, and this is how some people implement OKRs. However, you may have spotted the flaw with this, in that this is decidedly not agile. Agile is all about, we talk about self-organization, self-management, we're talking about empowerment, we're talking about giving autonomy to teams. We're pushing decisions down from the senior levels down to the people who are doing the work, the people who are on the front line, the people who are making decisions. So if you're using management by objective or cascading OKRs, it's not really agile. You may want to do that, but please don't claim it's agile. The way it needs to work, so this is just a return to the old command and control models. The way it needs to work, if we want to combine these two things, is we have our leaders. And our leaders tell us about the destination, the place they are leading the organization to. They paint a picture of the shining city on a hill. They motivate people to want to go there to achieve those missions. And then they leave white space. They let the teams decide. This may sound negligent, but the leaders don't try and tell the teams what to do. Because remember, we have largely standing teams because we're in a Spotify model, we're in a value stream model, we're in a no projects model, whatever you want to call it. We have teams that produce services and products, and the teams are largely continuous. Because in a digital world, you need those teams to service your digital products, don't you? So our leaders paint the destination, they enthuse us, and then they leave it up to the teams to decide. And the teams come along and the teams they say to the teams, how can you help? And the teams come back and the teams respond and say, given this team with this skills mix, with these people and the knowledge of this product and the responsibilities for this service, this product, whatever it is, in the next quarter, here are the things we will do in order to move this team and this organization towards the destination. We are leaving the decision-making process with those who are doing the work, those who are best placed to understand what needs doing. It's a deliberate attempt at devolving authority, allowing the teams to be autonomous. We can all share the destination. How we get there depends on the teams. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Oh my God, where's the coordination come from? Let's be clear here. The coordination doesn't come from some master planners who are going to coordinate all the teams. The problem with a lot of traditional planning is that it reserved the right to plan to people who were designated planners, and everyone else was there to implement the plans. Instead, what we have is not a hierarchical organization. Instead of thinking of your leadership team as somebody at the top of a pyramid, think of them instead as somebody at the center of your solar system. And your teams are all orbiting that sun. Your leadership team are there at the center. Everybody in the organization has a relationship with the CEO and the leadership team. By working for that organization, you have a relationship. You may never talk to them, you may never meet them, you may never be on the same continent, but you have a relationship with the leaders. You don't have relationships with lots of other people in the organization who are also orbiting leaders, and you may need to coordinate with them. But you know what? We let the teams do that. The teams define their objectives, and radically, the teams can talk to one another. The teams can talk to the leader. The teams can talk to other teams who they need to work with, who they need things from, who they need to do things for. This isn't about the leader saying, this is the way the world should be. This is the leader saying, this is what we're trying to achieve. How can you help us? And yes, the leader should be looking at the OKRs, and the team should be listening to what the leader says, because the leader's a stakeholder. The leader's a type of customer. So try and think of your teams not as a top-down pyramid hierarchical chart, but as planets and asteroids and moons circling the center. So you can have cooperation and communication with multiple stakeholders here. To change the metaphor slightly, I tend to, this picture sums up how I tend to think of it these days. And again, we've got these concentric circles. We've got different overlapping circles. And yes, the CEO is a particularly big stone dropped in this puddle. And the CEO sends out lots of waves. And they're going to affect all the people, all the teams in this organization. But you know what? Your competitors are doing the same thing. Your competitors are dropping pebbles into the same lake. And some of the waves your competitors create will amplify those of your CEO. Some of them will offset the CEO. Some of them will just disrupt them. And you've then got your customers, not just your competitors, people who are actually giving you money. And you've got your team, and you have your needs and your wants. And if you are supporting an existing product, you've also got to listen to that product. You can't constantly keep running it down, cutting corners. And you've got the other teams you work with, the other teams you need to coordinate with. So actually, it's not quite as predictable as a model of a solar system. It's more all these different waves that are coming out from different teams, different people, different organizations at different times. And your team, your mini organization has got to look at what all of these stakeholders and non-stakeholders, the effects they're having on you, and how do you respond? It's not just simply saying a boss at the top saying do this and everybody responding. There's competing forces, there are competing influences here. And by defining what you're going to do for the next quarter as OKRs, it allows you to highlight why you're doing things and what you're doing, and communicate back to other people to make some more ripples. So organizations exist for some purpose, and that purpose is largely invariable. Why does your company exist? I sincerely hope it's not simply to make money. I hope your organization has some benefit to the wider society, and you make money as a byproduct of servicing society's needs. So you have some purpose, some reason for being, and that is largely invariable. That continues for decades. Within that, the organization may have one or more missions, things it is trying to achieve, which build towards that purpose. And some of those missions may come and go. Some of them may last a long time. Some of them may only be brief. But in a large organization, there's multiple missions going on. This is just, you think of something like Microsoft. You could characterize all their different products as different missions that are going on. Missions have longevity as well, although they're not completely invariable. And then we have our OKRs. And every quarter, every 3 months, we come along with a clean sheet of paper, or day one mentality, as Jeff Bezos says, and the team clear down forget about what they're doing and say, right, given where we are today, given the resources we have, given the skills we have, given the customers we have, given the responsibilities we have, how can this team add to this mission for the next quarter? How will the team deliver benefits? And every 3 months, you stop and you take stock the same way we've been doing with 2-week iterations in Scrum for years and years now. We're wrapping another bigger sprint, if you like, although it's not quite a perfect analogy, on top of this, and saying periodically we stop and we think about bigger questions. Oof. So I think as a result of this, because we are periodically stopping and thinking about the bigger questions and codifying them and communicating them to people, this gives us the opportunity to supercharge prioritization. If you think of a team, where does the work come from? Yeah, we know in Scrum it comes from the backlog, yes. But you may also be fielding support desk calls. Real live customers might call up with problems. And maybe you're a DevOps team and you've got to support live running and upgrade the server and God knows what else. And maybe you're blessed with a sales team who come along and ask you to do demos and specials and things. Or maybe, customers just ask you directly. And there's also some history. All teams have some history, some stuff they have to do because it was. This is the way most teams are. And what I don't want you to do is say, hey, let's just add OKRs and solve this problem. Because if we just add OKRs and we don't change any of this, you're going to find your team is overloaded, there's more work in progress, and you make slower progress overall. So unlearning again. If we're going to add OKRs, we have to remove something. And my answer is quite simple. Everything is down to the OKRs. You do not get out of bed in the morning if it isn't an OKR. Okay. If you need to handle support desk calls, if you need to handle operations and all this other gubbins, you put it into your OKRs. You acknowledge it somehow. And that way, when people say, what is this team doing? You can show them. In amongst pursuing a big, bold project, you're answering the support desk, you're doing DevOps, you're talking to the salespeople, you're talking to customers, yeah. And if people don't like that, if you don't like it, then we can challenge whether you should be doing them, and we can have a bigger conversation here. So OKRs should not be an extra ingredient you add to your pudding. OKRs are the reason you add any of the ingredients to your pudding. Yes? Make everything subservient to the OKRs and don't get out of bed if it's not in the OKRs. So what do we do about the backlog? Which goes first? Do we write OKRs that relate to the backlog, or do we write a backlog that relates to OKRs? What if the backlog says do X and the OKRs say do Y? Who gets priority? So the other year when I was working with some teams and we were trying OKRs, I faced exactly this dilemma. And my conclusion was that we would make everything subservient to the OKRs. One of the other coaches in the organization, she had the same dilemma, and we talked it through, and she decided on the opposite answer. She decided that they would look at the backlog, they'd decide what backlog they're intending to do for the next 3 months, and they would then craft OKRs, which in general terms describe the backlog items that they're going to be doing. And both our teams set off. And 3 months later, we had coffee together. And she had already decided that she wanted to work my way. And the way I did it, it kind of worked. And it certainly worked better than her way of working, where they still had this backlog agony all the time. Most teams today have runaway backlogs, and they are slaves to the backlog. There's a tyranny of meeting the backlog, and we lose sight of the wood for the trees. So what I'm saying here is, with OKRs, throw away your product backlog. Yeah. Think every 3 months, stop and think about your strategic intent, what you want to be doing, what outcomes you want, and then any backlog you have will follow that. You do not do work just because it's in the backlog. You may find an item to help you do those OKRs in the backlog in the bin, which is great. But frankly, if you don't, you just write out the new item. We need to get away from this is constantly looking at the backlogs, because backlogs were a great idea and they've helped a lot of teams, but we now see the problems with backlogs. They're a tyrannical master. So let OKRs drive all your work and use OKRs as a story generator. You have your big objectives, and every sprint planning meeting or whatever your frequency, you stop, you look at the OKRs, you look at your progress, and you say, what do we need to do next to advance on this? And if necessary, you write a new story. You don't just go fishing in a backlog for stories that may or may not exist. You write them out. You create the work you need to do to advance your OKRs. So it's a bit like moving away from stored energy to generating our energy as we use it, just in time. There's a novel idea for you. So think strategically. Think about your outcomes, not your output. End tyranny of the backlog. Get purposeful with your development work. We call it PDD. Put the purpose of your organization, your mission, your goals, your strategy ahead of the backlog. Don't let yourself get bogged down in a backlog. Every sprint, you want to review your OKR status. You want to look at the highest priority OKRs that you still need to work on. And you just simply need to say, what do we need to do to advance here? What stories do we need to create here? This again is about putting power down to the team, the people who are doing the work. And hopefully the product owner has been talking to customers and they've been doing discovery and they've been thinking about what's needed. So they're coming in a little bit prepared. But the whole team is working on this. We're putting autonomy with the team to move towards that mission. So finally, what is success? What does success look like? I'll tell you, this is another point where you have to step back, because success is not doing 100% of your OKRs. In fact, most of the books you'll read on OKRs say just this. If you are hitting 100% of your OKRs, that is a sign of a problem. That is suggesting that you're not being ambitious enough, and OKRs want you to be ambitious. Now, let's flag up immediately. This is problematic because there are many people in your organization who value predictability above all else. And I know on one occasion, I was in a position of telling another team that my team would probably only hit 70% of their OKRs, and we weren't sure which ones we were going to hit and which ones we were going to miss. And that went down like a lead balloon. If you're after predictability, at the very least, you're going to need to tweak the OKR recipe. It may be you want to do something different. Success in OKRs is not 100% of OKRs. Do that too often, it's a fail. Many of the books will tell you that Google aim for 70% of OKRs achieved and 30% not achieved. I don't think that is success. That might be what Google does. It might not be right for you. But if you set a hard and fast number, 100% obviously, but even 70%, you will encourage game playing. You will encourage people to set themselves some OKRs they can meet to achieve the target, and then not to try too hard at the other OKRs. You get a sophisticated gaming going on. So I don't think 70% of OKRs is success either. Ultimately, this is where you have to step back. Success is the outcome. It's not whether you met all your OKRs or you failed all your OKRs or you hit 3 of them and whatever. Success is, did you create benefit? Did you add value? Did you advance the mission of the organization? Did you move towards that destination, that goal, that shining city on a hill that your leader was suggesting? Moving things forward. And don't forget that value added is not necessarily money in the bank. It's not even necessarily more product. It could simply be that you've learned things, that you have tested some hypothesis. You have discovered that customers will not buy orange cola. You know, you've learned something, and learning is valuable. So don't judge your OKRs and the number of OKRs you hit or missed. Step back and say, did we make the world a better place this quarter? Oof, I think I'm within time. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to reawaken our ambition around Agile here.
Nice one. Well, thank you, Alan. Now we have the chance for people to ask questions. I'm kind of hoping that there'll be lots of questions because you've said some fairly contentious things, as you are wont to do, around throwing away backlogs and OKRs for every work item. So what we have is we have a question from Craig Lynch. Craig, I'm going to unmute you, and if you then unmute yourself, you can ask Alan your question directly.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for that talk. That was really interesting. I think my question was about some of the terminology you were using about throwing the backlog away and understanding the difference
Just the terminology?
between the backlog and the OKRs.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you trying to say something there?
No. Go on. Carry on.
So what I was trying to get to was, are OKRs and the user stories in the backlog essentially going to be the same thing? So it's not so much throwing the backlog away, it's making sure your backlog is set by the OKRs.
Yes. The things you work on should be coming from the OKRs. And so you can do a little bit of experiment here. Suppose you go into a planning meeting and you look at your OKRs, and the OKRs mean that actually the most important thing to do now is translate the whole app to Spanish. If you've got a story in the backlog that says translated to Spanish, then fish it out and do it. But you know what? If there's no story in the backlog, you aren't going to not translate it. You're going to damn well write a story that says translated to Spanish, and you're going to get on and you're going to do it. You're not going to be beholden to the backlog. So yeah, backlog is little more than a collection of good ideas that people have suggested in the past, which may or may not be done. And unfortunately for many teams, they've become this tyrannical master, and teams are measured on how much backlog they can get done. And we want to throw that away and say, look at more strategically, are we moving forward here? And frankly, I don't see a great need for the backlog anymore. That's just like pre-work, a collection of ideas. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I think it's an interesting piece. I think for me, the backlog is prioritizing what's needed. That's where the OKR relationship comes in. I think throwing away the entire piece, it's an interesting concept for me just now. I'm not sure. I think for me, understanding that if these are your OKRs, that sets the priority of your work. And if something's hung around for 6 months, then obviously you're not getting to it. It's obviously not that important. And getting rid of it, that makes sense. And I think it's just that relationship between what you're terming as the OKR setting the agenda and making sure that OKRs are tied to the work you're doing. I think I agree with the principle. I think it's the mechanics I'm maybe struggling a little bit.
I'm going further than that. What I'm saying is the whole team own success or failure on this OKR, and the whole team should be involved with deciding what's going to work. If you are fishing things out of the backlog to do, then somebody has put them into the backlog, which means you have some other controlling force. Could be a team member, but it's not a team decision. You're saying that this team exists to execute a known set of work. And if you are staying in the known space, then you're not really being ambitious. So what we're saying here is actually go for, you can use OKRs the way you're talking about. You're saying somebody conveniently created this backlog and we're just going to prioritize them following the OKRs. But what I'm saying is it's more empowering, it's more dynamic if you work it out there and then. So don't be scared about losing your backlog. You have nothing to lose but your burn down charts.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Right, so I'm going to ask Hon Yao, are you still online? And if so, would you unmute yourself to ask the question, please? You're live? I don't hear you. We have sound problems. I'm afraid I'm going to mute you again, Hon, because I can't hear you at the moment, and we'll go to Andrew Jones. Andrew, if you'd unmute yourself.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Alan, thanks for a very thought-provoking presentation this evening. I'm not sure if you're aware, I come from the Agenda Shift team with Mike and the rest of them.
I probably know your name in Slack, but not here.
Right, okay. One of the things Sheltore, Gudmundsson, myself, and in fact Mike have been working on is actually leading with outcomes, as you know, but also tying them in with OKRs. But we're moving much more now to this tight, loose, tight and flight levels type working. And I'm not sure how much you've come across that, but the flight levels, as you know, is the 3 different levels where you have the execs coming out with their very clear vision and the outcomes that need to be achieved. And those leading with outcomes obviously come from the outside in type work. But that does not take away from the end of the day that when we get down to the team level, which is in tight, loose, tight, the loose area, the people closest to the customers, the team that's going to be able to work with the development team and everything like that to make sure that the product they're going to deliver or enhance meets the requirements of the customer. So we just cascade the things down from the top level to the middle level to the bottom level, and it goes back up as well. I don't think that means we need to get rid of the backlog. The backlog just needs prioritization. And I think I agree with one of the gentlemen that spoke earlier. I'm not a great one for Jira boards with tons and tons and tons of stuff in it. Don't get me wrong. You have to be pretty clear and precise what you keep in your backlog. And it's the grooming of the backlog every month in line with the OKRs that be coming down as part of the outcomes you're trying to achieve is what happens. So I still think you need the backlog, but you need to groom it. And the flight level process is how we do it.
Sorry, but I can't use the word grooming anymore. Jimmy Savile wrote that one off. Can we stick to refinement? Look, I've had this argument several times, and you go and try it for yourself.
Well,
I don't see any need for a backlog. In fact, I see a lot of sunk cost in the backlog, and I see a lot of teams who are slaves to their backlog. The tight, loose, tight stuff. I did look at it a bit. Mike commented that what I didn't talk about in this presentation is in the book I talk about the 13-week OKR cycle, and the way I describe it without knowing it, I've come up with something fairly similar to tight, loose, tight,
right.
loose, tight. And the idea is that every 13 weeks, every quarter, you sit down and you get tight about what you're trying to achieve. You flush out your new OKRs, you get your acceptance criteria, quantify, and you spend a serious amount of time asking yourself some hard questions.
Absolutely.
Then you go into the quarter and you kind of relax a bit and say, well, how the hell are we going to meet this? Let's work it out as we go along. And that's where we want the team to be contributing.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
But that's very much team. So look, here's our ambition. How are we going to do this? And I don't want people constrained by the backlog. I don't want them constrained by the sunk costs.
But I don't think it's constrained. I don't think it does constrain it. I'm using it in several companies now, and we just make sure what goes into the backlog is actually necessary. And if there's things in there, it'd be ripped out of it.
Yeah, I think you are blessed then. I've seen plenty of companies.
Of course I am. I work with Mike.
Yeah, teams are expected to produce a certain velocity, and they're expected to burn down the backlog, and that is pretty much the start and the end of the conversation.
No, that's where you're going down the safe and the scrum line and things like that,
So,
which
gentlemen,
you know and I know we avoid like the plague.
gentlemen, there's clearly a difference of opinion there. Thank you for that.
Very interesting. Thank you.
So I have two questions. Hon has typed his question in, and there's also a question of Sergey, and they're around the same topic. So Hon says, have you changed a traditional multi-level top-down company into the planetary structure, and how did you manage it? And Sergey asks, could you share an example of successful transformation from a command and control company into truly agile OKRs, especially what were your first steps to move from management by objectives to the approach of white space? So, have you got any examples?
I think my answer to that is it's above my pay grade. I would love to say I had done it, but so far, no, I haven't had the opportunity to really do it. I don't actually think there's many companies using management by objective. I think the problem with OKRs is they're reintroducing it from the back door. What I do find interesting is that some of the bigger name consultancies who are listening to this are moving in this direction, and you can see this by the popularity of the Spotify model that has sprouted everywhere the big consultancies go. And what people miss about the Spotify model is that actually the Spotify model is a no projects model. So we are generally moving in this direction. We are going at a snail's pace. I have had success in pockets of organization, as much by benign management neglect as by deliberate choice. But I think in the newer companies, the companies that have been born agile, born digital, I think you see this more. I hear stories of them being pretty close to this type of model. I am actually quite cynical about the ability of larger companies, legacy companies, to make all the changes we need, or all the changes I need. They all have to try, but I don't think anyone has succeeded in any company completely yet.
Thank you. I have a question from Olu. Olu, I'm going to unmute you. If you unmute yourself, there you go. Could you ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Alan, thank you very much for that. I find this quite interesting, and my question actually revolves around wondering if this approach does not downplay, the need for the ultimate planning activity, because whether we're doing agile or not, the dictum is right that if we fail to plan, we're actually planning to fail. So where does OKR come into this? Do we just bin it? Because you seem to be talking about let's bin the backlog, but of course, is the backlog not an essential aspect of our planning into success?
I completely reject your hypothesis. Planning is an act of command and control. You are reserving the right to have plans to those who are allowed to plan, and you disenfranchise many of the people in the teams because you have planned in advance. And so much for failure to plan being planning to fail. Planning is inherently limiting. If you want to be ambitious, you can't have a plan, because by definition, if you have a plan, it has to be a viable plan. If you're going to have a viable plan, it encourages you to go down the safety first route. If you want to be ambitious, and the OKRs do push the ambitious angle, then you have to be prepared to let go of your plans. Now, although I may sound like I'm staking out a case for no planning whatsoever, I'm not quite that radical. What I'm saying is planning needs to be democratized, and we need to involve the team members in the plan, and we need to involve their representatives, and we do need to go some forward planning. But this is less about planning than about having ambition. So if you think about the moon landings, when John Kennedy stood there and said we will land a man on the moon by the end of this decade, there was no plan to land a man on the moon. There wasn't even a plan to build a rocket big enough. They didn't even know how they were going to construct the lunar lander. Or now that was effectively, you know, he was planning to fail there because there was no plan, but he staked an ambition. And yet everything aligned around that. They found a way of doing it. They said, look, here's the constraints. We have 10 years, or 9 years, wasn't it? We have 9 years to do this. We need to land at least one person on the moon, and they worked backwards, and they found a solution that worked within the constraints they had. So I'm all for some degree of planning. What I'm saying is, when you over plan these things, there's a point you go past with planning where you are limiting your own ambitions, you are playing it safe. So we need to get away from this planning to the nth degree, because planning has rapidly diminishing returns. The first hour or two you spend planning is immensely valuable. By the time you get to the 7th hour in the planning room, you are not learning as much as you did in the first hour. By the time you enter the 7th day of planning, you're going backwards. So yeah, I reject this notion that failure to plan is planning to fail.
Alan, I agree with you in part. All right. Now the point is, I mean, from what I hear, you seem to be, you know, aligning yourself to the importance of planning, and yet you're still jettisoning it. You know, I think we just need to refine this in such a way that we can create a balance so that people would know, you know, yes, there is value in planning, but of course there is value in, you know, using this. It's just the approach has to be, you know, it's just got to be, we just create you know, the dynamics to ensure that we're getting better, you know, and best value for whatever we're doing. That's
we
what
need
I
objectives,
think.
we need ambition, but
Yeah,
I reject the notion that we need a plan.
but if we need objectives, how are we going to put that in play without
You're going
planning?
to work out as you go along. Do you know about James Stockdale? James Stockdale was the most senior American officer to fall into the hands of the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. James Stockdale survived his imprisonment in the Hanoi Hilton and came out. And when asked about how did he survive, he said because he had no plan. Because any plan he had would have been destroyed. Any plan he could have made, the Viet Cong could have derailed the next day. So having a plan would be demoralizing for him because it would keep on being uprooted. Whereas having an ambition, having a goal, and constantly reevaluating and working out what do we do next to move towards that, you keep up your morale.
Okay, thank you.
So I hear more disagreements. I'm not so surprised that there's some pushback on planning and backlogs. It's an area that is very contentious, and I'm glad I'm not having to defend your position at the moment. I think we've got time for one more. Duncan Christie, you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks, Seb. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, Alan, thanks for your presentation. A lot to think on there. I was particularly intrigued by the comment you made about not getting out of bed in the morning if there wasn't an OKR for it. I'm sure you said that for effect, but is there not a danger with that you have a proliferation of OKRs and you lose focus if you do that? I'm thinking about the humdrum stuff, the business as usual that you do need to get on with.
Yeah, this is a good question, and this business as usual is really one of the difficult things to reconcile with OKRs. It actually turns out to be really quite a difficult problem, and you know, some teams who do a little bit of business as usual probably are going to be okay, but teams that have a lot of business as usual, customer service, DevOps, things that are becoming more common today, this really becomes a problem because, as I said before, if you simply take everything you're doing and you just add OKRs, all you've done is increase the amount of work you've got to do. And the OKRs that get attention from the senior folks are the shiny new things that are gonna change something, are gonna look good and all the rest of it. And actually, certainly with the teams I was working with, the guts of their work was just keeping the lights on. But if you only write OKRs about the new things you're going to do, and you don't acknowledge that actually a lot of your capacity goes to keeping the lights on, then you've got a problem, because people won't recognize you're doing this work and they will complain you're not delivering the shiny stuff. So my solution to this is you have to acknowledge it in the OKRs. You have to put something into the OKRs that says, as well as doing all this shiny new stuff, all this new revenue creation, if you like, we are going to do some revenue protection. It's not all about adding new value. We're going to make sure that the value we're getting at the moment stays there, because if we don't do this stuff, it's not there. And I think you have to acknowledge that in your OKRs, so that at the end of the quarter, A, you can claim credit for it, and B, you can have a debate with those people who want you to do shiny new stuff and say, look, if we are keeping the lights on with all this stuff here, we've got a capacity limitation here. And if you have one piece of paper which lists OKRs and says, this is what we're going to do, and another different piece of paper that says, this is how we're going to keep the lights on, you haven't got all the facts in front of you. Now, your other point there was about the OKRs becoming a bit of a bucket list. And I don't want this to happen. This is the problem with backlogs. Backlogs have become a great big bottomless bucket, and we don't want OKRs to become that. So, you know, I'm just going to put out there 3 or maybe 4 OKRs tops. And I know people who are now arguing that there is only 1 OKR per quarter. I can see a lot of merit in that. I don't think it's going to work for all teams. So I'd say keep your OKRs to 3 or 4, and one of them should acknowledge that you've got all the BAU to do. And it doesn't matter how big your team is, whether your team is 5, 50 or 500, because you can't focus people on doing more than about 3 or 4 things.